In the century following Aegon Targaryen's conquest of Westeros, House Targaryen stood at the height of its power. With more than 20 dragons under its control, it ruled over its dominions with an iron fist. Its authority seemed absolute, its enemies powerless, and its greatest weapons remained unmatched anywhere in the known world. And then, within the span of only a few years, that power would suddenly vanish. A violent, interdynastic civil war would take place between rival factions of the Targaryen royal family, splitting the realm and resulting in the deaths of thousands of soldiers and civilians. The ensuing war which followed would result in the death of nearly all the dragons, almost ending the Targaryen dynasty itself, and turning the page on an era of consolidated dragon rule that had started 131 years earlier, when Aegon the Conqueror and his sister wives had first brought the Seven Kingdoms to kneel. So what went wrong? What circumstances could lead to the near ruin of a house that had once seemed impossible to challenge? How could a dynasty with such absolute power become so fractured that it tore itself apart? To better understand this, we have to look beyond the war itself and trace the chain of choices, rivalries, ambitions, and disputes that ultimately led to the bloodshed known as the Dance of the Dragons. 100 years after Aegon the Conqueror's conquest of Westeros, King Jaehaerys I ruled the Seven Kingdoms. Jaehaerys is considered by many to be one of, if not the greatest, rulers of the Targaryen dynasty. In his youth, Jaehaerys was called the Conciliator, a nickname given to him for his ability to reform the realm and consolidate the crown's power following the violent reign of his uncle, Maegor the Cruel. During his reign, Jaehaerys oversaw the improvement of infrastructure by constructing continental roads. He reformed many laws and taxes that helped the life of his constituents, and he repaired relations between the crown and the faith, all while re-centralizing the power of the monarchy after years of instability. His rule ushered in a golden age of peace, prosperity, and growth, yet by the end of his reign he had lived so long that most knew him not as the Conciliator, but rather as the Old King. For most of his reign, the future of House Targaryen appeared secure. King Jaehaerys had 2 adult sons. Well, actually he had 3, but his youngest son, Vaegon, had been sent to study to become a Maester at the Citadel of Oldtown. Vaegon was bookish, and seemed apathetic to the political life required of Targaryen princes in King's Landing. The king's eldest son, and heir, was Aemon. Aemon was a skilled legislator, already working in government as his father's Master of Laws. 2 years younger than him, Baelon, nicknamed the Spring Prince or Baelon the Brave, was good insurance for the security of the dynastic succession. An heir and a spare, as the saying goes. The 2 brothers were admired across the realm. Both were renowned for their honor and chivalry, both beloved by the small folk, and both were dragon riders. Aemon rode the bloodworm Caraxes, and Baelon rode the enormous Vhagar. Yet to onlookers, what stood out most about the 2 princes was the bond they shared with one another. The 2 brothers were fiercely competitive, but this extended only to the training yard. There existed no jealousy, bitterness, or political rivalry between the 2. In song and story, it was often said that never had there been 2 brothers who loved each other more than the sons of King Jaehaerys. A benefit of the brothers' closeness was that there was never any debate regarding their father's succession. It was always understood that Aemon was the heir apparent, and that he would ascend to the throne upon his father's death. That is, until the year 92 AC, when Prince Aemon, while on a scouting mission in Tarth, took a crossbow bolt to the throat, resulting in his death at just 37 years of age. The death of the beloved Prince Aemon threw the court into a state of disarray. For King Jaehaerys, it suddenly opened an issue of succession. With Aemon dead, who was to be declared his heir? Aemon had fathered no sons, but had left behind an adult daughter, Rhaenys. Rhaenys was 18 years of age at the time of her father's death, an intelligent and capable woman, and was also married to one of the richest men in the Seven Kingdoms, Corlys Velaryon, also known as the Sea Snake. Rhaenys had also just recently announced that she was pregnant, raising hopes for the possibility of her producing more heirs and dragon riders. As Prince Aemon's only child, it seemed to many that she would be the logical choice as heir. Jaehaerys was consulted on the matter of succession by his small council, consisting of some of his closest friends and most trusted advisors. At the time, the council consisted of his now dead son Aemon as his Master of Laws. Corlys Velaryon was Lord Admiral and Master of Ships. The opinionated Elazar had served as Grand Maester for over 30 years. Septon Barth, arguably Jaehaerys' closest friend, was Hand of the King. Sir Ryan Redwine was Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, and Lord Martin Tyrell served as Master of Coin. It is important to note that 2 of the strongest voices in favor of Rhaenys' claim were absent from these meetings, as Aemon was now dead, and Corlys had been sailing in support of the prince's mission to Tarth. So when the king's advisors gathered to consider the future of the realm, the 2 men most likely to defend Rhaenys' claim were not present in King's Landing. Interestingly enough, it is also worth pointing out that all the remaining council members happen to share an unusual connection, this being that they all had ties of some kind to the city of Oldtown. Oldtown, formerly the largest city in the realm, was the seat of some of the oldest and most powerful institutions in the realm. Grand Maester Elazar was, of course, trained in the citadel of Oldtown. Septon Barth served the Faith, whose religious capital is located in Oldtown. Sir Ryan Redwine is from the Arbor, a region closely tied to Oldtown through geography, trade, and alliance, and Lord Martin Tyrell was a previous acquaintance of Barth's and connected to the same broader Oldtown power structure. We will touch on the importance of the small council's Oldtown influence later on, but for now, what is important to note is the speed with which the king and his councillors came to a decision regarding the succession. Mere days after the news of his son's death reached King's Landing, Jaehaerys announced his new heir. The fact that an heir was named so quickly was rather strange, especially given the significance of the decision and that most of Rhaenys' supporters would have been away from court and unable to argue her claim. Nonetheless, following the death of his eldest son, Jaehaerys, after consulting with his small council, swiftly named his second son, Baelon, as his heir, passing over Rhaenys in the line of succession. Now would be a good time to examine the laws and customs of inheritance in Westeros. Under Andal and First Men custom, most of Westeros outside of Dorne follows male preference primogeniture. This is where the eldest living son in a line inherits before his sisters, regardless of age. In this system, daughters inherit only when there are no living sons left in a line. An important thing to consider when looking at male preference primogeniture, though, is that daughters still inherit before their uncles. A lord's daughter will be passed over in favor of her own brother, but she is not normally passed over in favor of her father's younger brother. Based on this understanding, which happened to be the standard system accepted across the realm, Rhaenys Targaryen, as the only child of Prince Aemon, should have stood ahead of her uncle Baelon in the line of succession. The fact that her father had died before inheriting the throne was legally irrelevant, as she still descended from the senior line of the family. To many, including the queen herself, the appointment of Baelon as heir was a confusing and prejudiced choice made by the king, favoring his more experienced son as heir over his young granddaughter. It seemed like the king, as the most powerful lord in the realm, was simply choosing an heir irrespective of custom. However, this was not exactly the case. Jaehaerys' decision, although not in line with Andal law, was in accordance with the established Targaryen inheritance precedent that had led to his own ascension. House Targaryen does not share the same roots as the Andal, Rhoynar, and First Men ethnic groups of Westeros. They are Valyrian, and thus have their own set of traditions and customs that they practice. The most well-known example of this is their practice of incestuous marriage between siblings or close relatives. Take Prince Baelon and his wife Alyssa, for instance, who were the son and daughter of Jaehaerys and Alysanne. While such a practice was considered deeply immoral and disgusting by the rest of Westeros and the Faith, the Targaryens defended it by arguing that they were ethnically different, and more specifically superior, evident by the fact that they literally flew on dragons, and were not bound by the same rules as other peoples. Jaehaerys himself had helped pioneer this idea in collaboration with the Faith, known as the doctrine of exceptionalism, after marrying his own sister Alysanne. Through the doctrine of exceptionalism, the Targaryens and their customs could exist alongside, or even above, the expectations of Westerosi society. It would be reasonable to believe that this doctrine also extended to any differences in customs of inheritance. The young Targaryen dynasty, not even a century old at this point, had undergone a few not-so-clean transitions of power in its short history, which might have been a sign of problems to come. Historically, the Targaryens had leaned towards a male-biased model of succession, where the continuation of the male line was favored. An early example of this can be found with Aegon the Conqueror himself. Aegon Targaryen was the second child of his father Aerion, having an older sister Visenya and a younger sister Rhaenys. Yet it was Aegon who inherited the seat of Dragonstone upon his father's death, bypassing his older sister. Following his subsequent conquest of Westeros and ascension to the Iron Throne, it was Aegon's oldest son Aenys by the younger sister Rhaenys who succeeded him. His younger son Maegor, who was born to him by his elder sister Visenya, was never considered as having a stronger claim than his older half-brother, despite being descended from the more senior maternal line of the family. The lack of any recorded challenge from Visenya, supporting either her or her son's claims, implies that Targaryen succession was typically based on the paternal line. So far, this resembles traditional male primogeniture. However, the precedent starts to get muddied when Aenys passes away, because his half-brother Maegor would end up usurping the throne and killing Aenys' designated heir and son, Aegon. Consequently, Jaehaerys' own ascension to the throne provides us with a new example and strong precedent, but this time for agnatic primogeniture. In an agnatic system, succession passes only through male descendants. Women are entirely prohibited from inheriting the throne, as are any male candidates claiming the throne through a female ancestor. In the absence of any sons, brothers, uncles, and nephews come before daughters, who have zero claim. In the following example, the Lord's eldest son is designated his heir. Should he die before inheriting, the succession continues along his line to his eldest son. This is typical for both male primogeniture and agnatic systems. However, should the grandson now die, the succession will bypass all women and their lines, moving to the Lord's younger brother. It never passes to either of his daughters or even their male descendants. So, under Andalic male preference primogeniture, which we discussed earlier, Jaehaerys' own claim would have been considered illegitimate. His deceased older brother Aegon had left behind 2 daughters, Arya and Rhaella, and Arya had even been named heir by Maegor himself. Yet when Maegor the Cruel died in 48 AC, both girls were passed over, and Jaehaerys was proclaimed king instead. Now, one could argue that this is not purely evidence of a formal tradition of agnatic inheritance, and more circumstantial the political situation at the time of Maegor's death. Maegor had been a usurper and a tyrant, and Jaehaerys was presented as a unifying male claimant who could restore peace. His nieces were very young, which, in combination with their sex, made them easier to dismiss in a moment when the realm desperately needed stability. Even their mother, Jaehaerys' older sister Rhaena, supported her younger brother's claim as king. So whether his ascension was driven by legal principle, political necessity, or both, the result was still that a new precedent was created and accepted by the realm. His own reign demonstrated that when given the choice between a senior female line and a viable male claimant, the crown would favor the male line. Additionally, through both Maegor and Jaehaerys' successions, one truth became crystal clear. A designated heir meant little if another claimant had the strength or support to take the throne themselves. Coming back now to the events of 92 AC, for Jaehaerys to now choose to elevate Rhaenys above Baelon would be to weaken the very logic that had once placed the crown upon his own head, and threaten the Targaryen image he had worked his entire reign to repair. Jaehaerys was not purely selecting his preferred heir. In his eyes, he was confirming an existing precedent, therefore preserving the legitimacy of the throne. Now, that does not mean that the decision was free from prejudice. Westeros is a patriarchal society, and Jaehaerys did not appear eager to become a trailblazer and see a woman sit the Iron Throne. But it would also be too simple to say that his choice was based only on personal bias. While one can question the ethics and prejudices of Targaryen custom, there is little doubt that Jaehaerys' decision to name Baelon his heir in 92 AC was supported by a precedent that placed male heirs ahead of female claimants. Baelon represented the continuation of the same logic that had placed his father on the throne, and there was every reason to believe that this was a safer and more legitimate choice. Despite the tumultuous successions of the first few kings in the Targaryen dynasty, this decision, although not etched into legislature, seemed like it cemented the precedent that a female descendant should be passed over in favor of a brother or uncle in the line of succession. Apart from Rhaenys Targaryen's own supporters, which happened to be her husband's family the Velaryons and her mother's family the Baratheons, most of the other nobility in Westeros were at peace with this decision. After all, agnatic succession, while different from Andal customs, still reflected the established Westerosi culture of favoring a male heir over a female. Despite leaving an everlasting rift between the king and his queen, who was upset at the decision, Jaehaerys' succession was once again secured. That is, until 101 AC, when Prince Baelon, heir to the Iron Throne and at that point Hand of the King, died of what is believed to have been a burst appendix. Once again, the untimely and unfortunate death of one of his sons would reopen the issue of succession. Jaehaerys' only surviving son, Vaegon, the same son who had left to become a Maester, was disqualified from consideration, if not by his own wishes, then by his vows as an Archmaester. However, upon the death of his brother, Vaegon did return to King's Landing and served as counsel to his father regarding the succession. The dilemma then became whether the throne should now pass through Aemon or Baelon's line. Now that both of his sons were dead, how would the king choose which children came first in the order of succession? Aemon's line had been the senior branch of the family tree, and through him came Rhaenys and now her son Laenor Velaryon. But by having already passed over Rhaenys once and naming Baelon heir, many now believe that Baelon's living sons had the stronger claim, as they would have inherited had their father survived to become king. Jaehaerys was now even older than before, and no longer as sharp as he had once been. On both sides of the family, followers were amassing men and power to effectively fight for their side's claim for the throne. Faced with the prospect of once again making a decision that would inevitably anger one branch of his house, and fearing that the dispute might soon erupt into civil war, Jaehaerys, following the recommendation of his son Vaegon, decided to call a meeting of the Great and Lesser Lords of Westeros. This gathering would come to be known as the Great Council of 101 AC. Meeting at Harrenhal, the nobility of the realm would assemble to debate and vote on whose claim was strongest, and deliver their recommendation to Jaehaerys, who would not actually be attending the council himself. In truth, only a few individuals were ever seriously considered. Their primary contenders were once again the Princess Rhaenys, her son Laenor Velaryon, and Prince Baelon's eldest son Viserys. Rhaenys represented the claim of Aemon's line directly. Laenor represented that same senior line while offering a male claimant. Viserys, meanwhile, represented the line of Baelon, the man that Jaehaerys had already named heir almost a decade earlier. We are told that Rhaenys' claim was dismissed as a matter of her sex, and ultimately the vote came down to her son Laenor and cousin Viserys. Ultimately, the Great Council selected Viserys Targaryen, the son of Baelon, to be named heir to the Iron Throne by the king, and in doing so confirmed the realm's support for the precedent of agnatic succession that Jaehaerys himself had supported back in 92 AC, wherein female claimants to the throne and their lines would be passed over in favor of the eldest male relative. When examining the decision made by the Lords of the Great Council, a few interesting explanations emerge as to why Viserys was chosen. One point often raised is that Viserys had been the last known rider of Balerion the Black Dread, the old dragon of Aegon the Conqueror. Even though Balerion had died years earlier, and Viserys had not attempted to claim a new dragon since, this connection might have served as a sort of symbolism for Targaryen power in the eyes of some lords. However, others would argue that this fact was largely irrelevant. 2 of the last 4 kings had not ridden Balerion, so why should Viserys' dead dragon matter at all? If anything, Rhaenys had the stronger dragon riding argument, since she was still an active rider. A stronger and more practical argument for Viserys is that he was already a grown man, 24 years of age, married, and had a daughter. He was a kind man, quick to please, and he would be able to rule in his own right immediately. Laenor Velaryon, by contrast, was still a child. Given Jaehaerys' old age and deteriorating health, it was likely that if Laenor were chosen, the realm would soon be ruled through a regency, and that regency would almost certainly be dominated by his father Corlys Velaryon. Many lords may have voted against this outcome not because they loved Viserys, but because they feared giving even more power to the already wealthy and ambitious Sea Snake. Another theory is maybe the most complex, yet perhaps the most interesting of the potential underlying motivations taking place at Harrenhal. There are many who believe that the outcome of the Great Council of 101 AC was rigged, and that the entire operation was part of a plot orchestrated by the Maesters to ultimately place Viserys Targaryen on the throne. The Maesters are the great scholarly order of Westeros. They serve as the scientists, doctors, historians, teachers, and record keepers of the realm. Their center of power is the Citadel, a kind of grand university located in the city of Oldtown, where all Maesters go to be trained. The theory goes that the Maesters hate dragons, because the magical beasts are the antithesis to science, reason, and knowledge. So the Maesters have been conspiring and working to undermine the Targaryens' dragon power, with the end goal of one day eradicating dragons entirely. This theory is known as the Grand Maester Conspiracy. In this view, the Great Council might have been one move in a much larger plan to weaken the Targaryens, and the Maesters would have certainly had ample opportunity to influence the outcome at Harrenhal. As practiced and respected teachers, scholars, and orators, they were welcomed at Harrenhal to speak and counsel on the matter of succession, allowing them to shape the opinions of many lords. The Great Council was also designed in such a way that Septons of the Faith were also welcome to attend and share their opinions. The Faith of the Seven, whose center of power also resides in Oldtown, had enjoyed a relatively peaceful relationship with King Jaehaerys. Yet historically, the Faith still had its reasons to resent the Targaryens and their dragons. After all, Maegor the Cruel had burnt the Sept of Remembrance in King's Landing and slaughtered thousands of devout worshippers during his war against the Faith barely half a century prior. So it's a very real possibility that the Faith might also have secretly been in support of an anti-dragon agenda at the council. Adding more credence to the Maester conspiracy is the fact that it was the Maesters who handled the voting at the Great Council. We are told that Viserys won by an overwhelming margin, supposedly 20-1, but the actual votes were never made public. On its face, such a suspiciously lopsided and vague result reeks of possible misplay. It raises the possibility, at least to those who believe in the conspiracy, that the Maesters may have manipulated the process to achieve the outcome they desired. And Viserys was exactly the kind of candidate they would have wanted. He was no longer a dragon rider, and Viserys had never attempted to claim another mount since Balerion's death. Rhaenys, on the other hand, was an experienced dragon rider, and her son Laenor already had a dragon hatchling of his own. By maneuvering the council toward Viserys, and perhaps even rigging the results outright, the Maesters may have helped place a weaker, less dragon-centered branch of the family closer to the throne. Some even point to Vagon, the son of Jaehaerys himself, as a possible participant in the plot against his own family. Having been away from King's Landing for so long, he had become trusted enough by the Citadel to rise to the upper rank of Archmaester. Perhaps he too had been drawn into the Citadel's grander designs. After all, it was he who had advised Jaehaerys to hold the Great Council in the first place. Now this is where the rabbit hole goes even deeper. Some suggest that the Maesters' conspiracy may have had something to do with the coincidental death of Aemon and subsequent bypassing of Rhaenys nearly a decade earlier. Looking back now at the events of 92 AC, it becomes apparent that the established succession might very well have been problematic for the Maesters' underlying plans. Aemon's line was full of dragon riders, and potentially set to produce more through its marriages to the Velaryons, who, although not dragon riders themselves, were of Valyrian descent. So, was it merely an unfortunate coincidence that following the announcement of Rhaenys' pregnancy, her father is suddenly killed, she is passed over in the succession, and the Velaryons are basically pushed out of the political life of King's Landing? These claims are speculative, sure, but they become more intriguing when we recall that the members of Jaehaerys' small council who advised them on naming Baelon heir all held connections, direct or indirect, to Old Town and its implicit anti-dragon institutions. This Old Town political bloc could have been just one component of the scheming and maneuvering that eventually led to Viserys, unknowingly on his part, being designated heir all these years later. And in the end, whether the council was rigged, influenced, or entirely legitimate, the outcome remained the same. It confirmed Viserys as heir and sidelined Rhaenys and the Velaryons. Now, one could easily make the argument that this whole council, regardless of whether it was rigged, influenced, or even remotely legitimate, was just a ruse. In the end, the outcome was never really in doubt. Again, it is worth reiterating that the result of the Great Council was technically only a recommendation to the king on whom he should select as heir. Jaehaerys still retained final say in the matter. From this perspective, Jaehaerys might have already known that it was very likely the Lords of the Realm, wanting a male ruler, would vote to uphold his precedent by selecting Viserys. So effectively, by calling a Great Council, Jaehaerys could get the result he already wanted, but without actually appearing to make the decision himself. Jaehaerys had successfully avoided taking responsibility for the decision. While Jaehaerys had managed to secure the succession in his own lifetime, the Great Council of 101 AC also left behind several dangerous ambiguities rather than concrete law. Despite two succession crises being resolved in a similar way, Jaehaerys never formally cemented the precedent into law, leaving its meaning open to interpretation. To some, the council proved beyond doubt that a woman could never sit the Iron Throne. To others, it proved only that the king's chosen heir, once accepted by the realm, could override the normal order of succession. But one could argue that the most dangerous precedent established in 101 AC was the decision to hold a Great Council in the first place. Rather than simply declaring the rightful heir according to precedent, the council gave power to the idea that royal succession could be a question, open to interpretation and debate. It suggested that when the succession became uncertain, the realm itself could be invited to weigh the claims. The old king may have believed he was preventing conflict, but in reality, he was weakening the royal authority he had spent his entire life strengthening, and in doing so, had opened a door that future generations would struggle to close. For the moment, however, crisis was averted. When Jaehaerys passed away 2 years later in 103 AC, Viserys, first of his name, ascended the Iron Throne as King of the Seven Kingdoms. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to History Sandbox if you want updates when we have new videos coming out. Let us know in the comments what we got right, what we missed, or what topics you'd like to see next.